Former Police Superintendent Garry McCarthy joined me yesterday afternoon for an extended conversation that will be a full-length podcast on Live from my office later this week. We talked about police shootings, videos of police action, the lack of support and the lack of understanding from the media, but also from people in general. Many other important topics here. We even get into Laquan McDonald, which you'll hear in part two. In this first part one, I asked McCarthy about his reaction to last week's release of the Dexter Reed footage.
You know, I'm very confused and disappointed by the way it was presented by the administration in Chicago to the public. I'm still uncertain why the police superintendent was not at that press conference. Larry Snelling, I'm not sure what's going on there, but I get asked this question probably 10 times a day. Yesterday, I played golf with a whole bunch of friends of mine, so I got asked this question about 30 times yesterday. Sure. You know, what's the deal with it? And I say very simply, don't shoot a police officer. Right. Because we're trained to mitigate the threat, and that's when you stop shooting.
And mitigating the threat is a really important part of this story, because a core question that comes to everybody's minds is the lazy, underfunded reporting that goes on now. And I'm slamming the media for this because there are people who are working in A-line reporting and anchoring positions now who 10 or 20 years ago wouldn't have been hired. They don't have the experience. They don't have the connections. They don't have the networking. And if we heard about some of these stories going on where a cop to defend his or herself fired 3 times and not 16 times, to me, it would still be the same story. It's just the number of bullets is the flashpoint, and that's what the media jumps to immediately.
Yeah, and you know what, Steve? The thing that I say to people when they say, yeah, but what about 95 shots or 96 shots, however many it was? I say, well, let me ask you this question. Deadly physical force is 1 bullet. What if he got killed with 1 bullet? Would we still be having this discussion?
Right.
Because that would have mitigated the threat right there. And honestly, the end of the video that I saw with the officer firing from basically a straight line behind the car when he got out, you can't tell if he has something in his hand, and he's just been firing. You have a cop down already.
Right, and you're making split-second decisions to take care of the scenario, to mitigate, as you said, but also split-second decisions to protect your own life, so you get to go home that day. The Tribune story about Derek Reed paints a much different picture than a lot of you may know or think. You know, the footage and the camera you're talking about shows officers getting out of an unmarked police vehicle, weapons drawn, and repeatedly ordering Reed to roll down the SUV's tinted windows. He initially complies. He doesn't roll down the passenger window. Moments later, Reed appears to shoot the CPD officer standing on the passenger side. The other 4 officers then do as they've been trained. They open fire, and Reed exits the vehicle and eventually falls to the pavement. And it's unclear whether he was still firing at that point. But this is not, and God bless him, but this is not a kid who was a choir boy. He was a very troubled young man, in and out of trouble all the time. He had been engaged in other incidents. He was shot and seriously injured previously in the commission of a crime. And what really makes me crazy is when I see quotes like this. Sharon Fairley, a professor at the University of Chicago Law School and a former chief administrator of COPA, and we'll talk about what COPA is in a second, said each of the 4 officers who fired their guns are going to be required to explain why they expended each round they fired. Here's her quote. The idea here is that the officer can't just discharge a firearm just because the colleague next to him or 10 feet away from him is discharging. They have to be able to identify a threat and use force, and why they're using force in response to a specific threat themselves. That is one of the most insane quotes I've ever seen about a real-time situation where bullets are flying in the air. Because if you can't depend on your instincts as an officer and the training you've got, you certainly can't process it the way this professor from COPA says the rules say you should process that incident. I mean, what can you say about that?
Well, I could say one thing. I can assure you that she's never been in a gun battle.
Right.
And the other thing is you would expect that somebody who was investigating police shootings would understand something called reflexive response, which is one guy fires, everybody fires. Okay. That didn't happen in this case because one guy fires, everybody fires. The gun battle would have sounded like this, and it's over. Right.
Right.
But it pop, 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 and it went back and forth, and it was staccato. And I kind of expected, when I heard that there were a lot of rounds fired, that was going to be the case, that it was reflexive response, but it was not. And it went on, what a number, 41 seconds. What a what a coincidence. The other thing,
Right.
Steve, is the gun was recovered in the vehicle.
Right.
And I know that because on the body cam that I saw, there's an officer who says, look, there's the gun right there. It's in the car. Now, mind you, the female officer who was on the driver's side of the vehicle in the initial stop, when Dexter is down, he's face down, and she's saying he's still got the gun, and she's trying to pull his hands out from underneath him so that they can get the gun. So they thought he still had the gun. And you're not going to make up a story in that amount of time.
Of course not.
So
as this investigation goes forward, answer a couple of quick questions for me. Why do these investigations take a year?
Well, because they're lazy, that's why. When a murder occurs, I don't know if you know this, but police officers, detectives, investigators will work 24/7 for probably at least a week or so on that case doing nothing else. And you have homicide teams that come in to support them to keep them going and getting these things done. COPA works 9 to 5, and they might have a skeleton crew that comes out on midnights to see if there's anything else, if there happens to be another case. They don't work the way the police work, yet they're investigating police. And I'm guessing the reason why you asked that question is because one of the things that's very troubling to me is this issue of transparency. Because by releasing a video without any context, the officers hadn't made statements at that point. Yet the head of COPA says, well, all we've got is a seatbelt violation. Now, where did they get that from? They didn't get it from the officers because they haven't made statements. And they couldn't have seen a seatbelt violation because the tinted windows were up, which is a very dangerous situation for a police officer. And if you watch the beginning of the video from start to finish, these men and women jump into their vehicle and take off like the hammers of hell. And then they pull up in front of this vehicle. They didn't put on their lights and pull them over from behind. So there was something else afoot here. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it was, but we'll certainly find out. But that raises questions. And the other thing, and I'm sure you know this, Steve, is the first 3 reports from the scene are generally incorrect. And
yes, I've heard that. Yeah.
When we start releasing information that is partial or hearsay or unconfirmed, we're causing more harm than good.
It is 7:46. We'll get a traffic update here and then part 2. We get into the Laquan McDonald case, which is the reason Garry McCarthy was no longer the superintendent, though Rahm Emanuel said it had nothing to do with his performance when McCarthy eventually left the job, and not by his choice. We'll continue with part 2 with Garry McCarthy in just a second. Still to come, Jeffrey Bear, host of Chicago Mysteries on WTTW, the weird and wild stories of Chicago. From Weird and Wild, Jeffrey Bear.
Airs tonight. I'm excited to talk to him.
And Dr. Bill Hillman later. He's in CNN's documentary Seeing Red about the run with the bulls in Pamplona, Spain.
Right. That's great. That's a fun watch, too.
He's a Chicago guy. He got gored by a bull. And twice.
A different bull, 2 different years.
And we actually interviewed the bull back then, too. So we'll see if we get the bull back. In the meantime, let's continue here because it's an important conversation with the former police superintendent. And again, this will be a part of a full Live from My Office podcast later in the week. Live from My Office right now featuring
Arnie Granite, the great concert promoter. But later in the week, we're going to put this one up. Garry McCarthy, we talked about Laquan McDonald. And I asked him about anything in his job he could have done better and how he felt about the way the entire situation was handled.
You know, I had limitations based upon the law, what I could and couldn't do. And what I've tried to explain to people, and naturally, you know, there are people who just are never going to accept anything. If I released evidence that was part of a federal grand jury, the U.S. attorney would delight to indict a police chief.
Big story.
For compromising an investigation. So, and besides which, people don't even know that it was the practice at the time not to release evidence in a police-related shooting or any other investigation that the state's attorney was involved in. So, in my mind, I did exactly what I was supposed to do. I notified my superior about the issues. We reviewed the tactics. And in doing so, we would come up with recommendations of how to knock down police-related shootings, which we did. And I believe they were down about 75% during my 5-year tenure.
Right. Yeah, I remember that number. You smacked in the face at all by the irony of the fact that we were talking about not releasing evidence in Dexter Reed's case, and this stated need for transparency. Because that doesn't seem all that transparent to me.
No, it's not. First of all, by not completing an investigation, you're doing a disservice to everybody, whether it's Dexter Reed, his family, or the officers who are involved, or the public at large. You're doing a disservice because there are people who love the cops, there's people who hate the cops, and there's people who can go either way in between, right? And we're poisoning the well. We're putting information out there that is not given context. It's not given a story. The officers haven't made statements yet. Yet the head of COPA is saying it was a seatbelt violation. Well, you can't have it both ways. If they can't make statements, you can't say what they were thinking and why they did what they did. But that's what she did.
Selective transparency. And Fran Spielman, I'm glad you brought her up. She wrote a piece about this and a number of pieces about this, which I'd recommend for people as well. Let me ask you a couple of basic questions, and I'll give you a chance to wrap up anything that we didn't talk about because I've already kept you too long. One of the things that jumped out of one of these stories was the lack of tasers, and how tasers weren't standard operating equipment. I could be misremembering this, but I feel like one of the first conversations you and I had when we talked about changes to the department, it's one of the things you wanted to see happen, that cops would be equipped with tasers. Was that a budget thing that they weren't?
No, I don't think it was a budget thing. Sergeants had tasers. Two things that still rile me up is the fact that during the entirety of the event with Laquan McDonald, which I don't even know how many minutes it went on, but the two officers who responded to the job did a magnificent job. One got out of the car and was following him on foot. McDonald went over and stabbed the tires of the police car.
In front of a cop. Textbook de-escalation by the cops.
They stayed with him and they put it over the radio. Not one supervisor took command of what was going on, which really troubles me. And that was the individual who had the taser, okay? So sometimes they screw up. Sometimes they do it on purpose because they don't want any accountability or liability. And in this case, a lot of people paid the price for it.
Last question, and then anything else you want to add. But the number of shots fired piece. I go back to being in the FBI Citizens Academy and the eye-opening thing that was for me. They put you on a simulator. It's nothing like the real world, but you're on a sim. You got to decide in a split second if a bad guy has a gun and he's going to do something. You fire the shots in the sim, and then they ask you how many shots you fired. Invariably, you say 3, 4, and invariably it's 15 or 20.
Right.
You train to be a cop in those situations. How do you train a cop not to fire 16 times? I mean, that to me seems counterintuitive when the job is to mitigate the situation, meaning take out the person who could take out you and your fellow officers or innocent bystanders.
Well, I think the problem that we have is our our training is cookie cutter. In New York, we would go to the range 50 at a time, 50 spots across a range, and they tell you fire 2, fire 3, fire 2, fire 3, and in between you're supposed to be assessing the situation. Different people react in different ways to stress, and you know, knock on wood, so far in my 43-year career, I've never fired my gun except for at the range, and I made lots of gun arrests. Let's put it that way.
Amazing thinking about where you've been.
Yeah, yeah. As a matter of fact, I made 5 gun arrests as the superintendent. It's there's nothing like it, quite frankly, because you know you did something good. But there was one time where I thought I fired a shot and I didn't, because I was I'm pulling the trigger, and all of a sudden I realized there's somebody sitting on this car, and the gun went up in the air. I thought it was the recoil, and we had revolvers at the time. And after we grabbed the guy with the gun, I checked my gun, and the cylinder had actually turned. That's how far I had pulled the trigger, but I let it go. So that's the closest I ever came, although there were a number of times that I came almost that close. But different people react to stress in different ways. I've always had this thing, and maybe it's from playing a lot of sports, that in stressful situations, it's almost like things slow down for me. It's like a high-speed camera. When that camera's going, you look at it and it's in slow motion. And all the crises that I've been involved in over the course of my career. So, you know, not everybody has that experience. And I'm not ever going to make an excuse for an officer who, I'm never going to make an excuse for Jason Van Dyke. I'm never going to make an excuse for him. But I also understand that he probably didn't even realize he fired 16 shots, just like you just said.